Thank you for joining us for episode 3, Procurement Strategies and Advanced Delivery Models, P3s for Municipalities in our 6-part webinar series. Welcome back to those who have been with us since the beginning, and for those who may be joining us for the first time. My name is Lisa Mitchell. I'm the President and CEO of the Council, and I'll be introducing today's episode and our speakers. I would like to start, though, by first sharing a huge debt of thanks to our sponsors for the series, Amico, BLG, EPCOR, Fasken, Graham, and Mainline. Because of their generous support, we're able to bring you this important content to life. Our goal at the Council is to educate public owners and procurers on the P3 potential for their projects, when and where they make sense. P3s are not the right solution for every project, but they are a tried and tested solution and can work for many assets. At a time when government funding for infrastructure is increasingly tight, municipalities need more tools to procure and tap into private capital and expertise, not fewer. And so for this reason, the Council established our Municipal Engagement Advisory Group, made up of both public and private sector members and who have experience with P3 models. This group has played a key role in developing our recent municipal recommendations and the P3 guide for municipalities. Several MEG members will be facilitating all of the episodes, including today. And right now, I would like to take an opportunity to introduce them. Today's facilitators bring exceptional expertise and leadership in the P3 and infrastructure sectors. And as I mentioned, are members of the Municipal Engagement Advisory Group. First, we have Edward Ng. He's a partner and infrastructure and project finance advisory with EY Canada. Edward has been focusing on providing transaction support and lead advisory services in the execution of infrastructure financing and public-private partnerships. He has over 19 years of related experience and advises public and private sector clients on infrastructure decisions and projects of all scales and asset classes across the full infrastructure lifecycle, from planning through to the exit. Edward has been involved in over 35 infrastructure projects with a combined value in excess of $30 billion. Welcome, Ed. Next, we have Claudia Pooli, Barrister and Solicitor, Legal Services, City of Edmonton. Claudia has worked as a solicitor with the City of Edmonton Legal Services Branch since May 2000. During her career with Edmonton, she has provided advice with respect to a variety of practice areas, including procurement, municipal utilities, design and construction, bylaw, prosecution, municipal delegation of authority, municipal finance, intellectual property ownership and licensing, environmental liability, corporate governance, grant funding, and provision of social and recreation services. So go to for any questions you might have. Some of the major projects that she's been involved in include the Capital Line South Extension Design Build, the Valley Line West Design Build Finance, the Drainage Utility Transfer to EPCOR, Valley Line LRT P3 Procurement, and the Downtown Arena. Big thanks to each of you for joining. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Edward, to set the context for today's episode. Welcome.
Great, and thanks very much, Lisa, and hello, everyone, and pleasure to be here today. For today, we have a set of slides put together, and we have some learning objectives. So really just kind of as a quick overview of what we're hoping to cover today. I know we have about an hour and a half. Our main focus is really to focus on Chapter 3 of the Guide for Municipalities. If you haven't had a chance to download it, it's available through the CJP3 website. But Chapter 3 does focus on various procurement delivery models, and that's where we'll be spending our time today. We'll also be spending some time talking about some City of Edmonton specific projects. So Claudia is going to go through some examples of projects using different delivery models that the City of Edmonton has undertaken. Just a little bit of a roadmap for today. I'm going to start off by talking about traditional P3 delivery models, then get into some progressive P3 delivery models that some of you may have heard of that some projects are using now. And then we'll actually go back and talk about some of the more conventional procurement models, just as a little bit of a recap as well. But most of you, I suspect, will be familiar with those. We'll talk about some other alternative delivery models, and then finally get into some of the case studies. So starting with P3 delivery models, I'll often describe these as classic P3 models or conventional P3 models, in that P3 models are alternative delivery models, but they have been around for some time now. And so with some new emerging delivery models, I like to refer to these as some of the classic P3 models. And you'll see that as I go through these different delivery models, there is sort of an escalating level of risk transfer over to the private sector partner. It's probably also important to note that for all these different delivery models, there's usually some variations you can apply to these. So, while these delivery models exist, often different jurisdictions that are using these different delivery models may borrow some elements that you might see in other delivery models for the delivery model that they're applying. So first off is design, build, finance. And so this is where the public sector owner is engaging a private sector party to assume responsibility for and the risk related to the design, construction, and financing of a project. So it really bundles all those three disciplines together. Payments are linked to construction completion milestones. Quite often for a design, build, finance, the payment doesn't actually happen until the very end, till substantial completion is established. You may have some instances as well where it's a larger project and there could be some project milestones in addition to that final payment that happens. But the idea being most of it is paid at the very end. And that does a variety of things. It encourages on-time and high-quality delivery of construction because there's no payment made or largely no payment made until the very end. That really encourages on-time completion of the project. It also avoids upfront capital investments by the public sector because they're waiting to the end to make payments, and therefore that financing risk, whatever financing is used, usually debt financing, that is the responsibility of the private sector. One thing to note, though, that this does stop at the end of construction. So at the end of a design build finance project, that asset gets handed over to the public sector owner, and the public sector owner will operate and maintain the asset as they normally would if they had built the asset themselves. If I just move over to the illustration on the right, it's often helpful to kind of look at these P3 projects in the form of these sort of wire diagrams. And I'll start with that box kind of towards the bottom, the special purpose vehicle box. So that's a special purpose vehicle, a legal entity that usually the private sector partner will establish in order to undertake this project. And then that SPV will have a contract between them and the public sector as the owner. So that's the box above it. Also kind of flowing into the SPV box is importantly the lender's box from the right. And that's the private financing that the SPV and the private partner will establish to help pay for the project, that debt financing during the construction phase. And then there's also a box on the left from the public sector as owner, and that's in the case where there might be some milestone payments. And it's that SPV that then contracts with a design build contractor through a design build contract to construct the project. And there also may be some subcontractors involved, and that's going to be the responsibility of the design build contractor. One other thing to note here is from the public sector as owner box, you'll see to the right, there's a maintenance and rehabilitation box. So that's really my point about earlier about the asset getting handed over at construction completion, and then the public sector owner bearing the responsibility of maintaining it and operating that asset, and that may be done themselves or maybe done through some contract. Claudia, anything you want to add on this slide for DBF?
No, I think it properly reflects how a DBF, is usually structured. And I can say the City of Edmonton has used this model for the Valley Line West LRT project, which I'll describe in a bit more detail later.
Great, thanks, Claudia. Moving on to the design build finance maintain project. So this is just the addition of the maintenance portion of the project. This, because it includes the maintenance, it's usually a long-term contract. Usually we see roughly a 30-year DBFM in Canada. Sometimes it's slightly longer, sometimes slightly shorter, but it's really that maintenance aspect of the contract that's important here. Again, a group comes together, a special purpose vehicle is created, but this time there's also a maintenance provider that's included as part of that consortium. So some of the advantages of this really is that because it includes the design, the construction, the maintain phases of the project, it really does take into account sort of a whole life consideration for the asset. So, not only how do you best design and construct it, but also, how will the asset maintain and what sort of efficiencies can be incorporated in the design that's going to help with maintenance down the road. You don't get that with the DBF because the maintenance component is not the responsibility of the private partner. Some of that might be lacking, although that's not to say it won't happen. It's just that they're less incentivized to do that. In terms of the maintenance scope, again, that's the responsibility of the private partner. And, there's some examples here, transit, biosolids, composting facility, roads and bridges. These are all asset classes that municipalities have used the DBFM projects for. So if I just go to the wire diagram on the right, again, you'll see something very similar to kind of what you saw in the DBF slide. I guess some key differences, though, is where you see the special purpose vehicle box to the left, now you have actually a private sector partner or investor. So these projects, because they have a long-term component in terms of the private financing that's used to pay for these projects, there's usually debt and equity involved. They are highly levered projects typically in Canada. So in Canada, usually it might be roughly a 90-10 split. So that's 90% debt and 10% equity. Of course, debt is less expensive than equity. So the more debt you can get in there that is still palatable to lenders, the better for the project costs anyways. And then also just below the special purpose vehicle box, you'll see that there's not only the subcontract for the design build subcontractor, which we have on the DBF slide, but also a subcontract for the maintenance and rehabilitation subcontractor. The other thing to note is the arrow between public sector as owner and special purpose vehicle. There's an arrow with a label saying availability payment. So that is a characteristic of particularly Canadian DBFM projects. Most of them are going to be availability payments, which means that the public sector is going to be making some sort of a lump sum payment on usually a monthly basis, and that's going to be an all-in payment that is going to be paying the SPV over the 30 years of the contract for making that asset, whatever it is, available to the public sector owner to use. That availability payment, again, is an all-in payment. So the special purpose vehicle is going to get that payment, and that's going to cover any debt service they have to provide for to the lenders. It's going to cover equity returns. It's going to cover kind of any costs to maintain the asset kind of over the life of the contract. That's, again, an all-in payment. And then there's deductions that can be taken from that to the extent that there's kind of performance deficiencies.
Ed, there was a comment in the chat about the inclusion of a renewal component in the DBFM model. Can you speak to that, whether that's typical or?
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Derek. I think that's, the renewal component. I'm not sure, Derek, if you're referring to the rehabilitation part of it, but it's the idea of there's the maintain the asset kind of ongoing year after year. But you also have to renew the asset because the 30-year period is an extensive period. So, usually there are some life cycle or rehabilitation components that are needed. And that's, it might be periodic, just depending on the life of the different components of the asset. It could be 5, 10, 15 years into the project. And I often call them sort of like lumpy payments in that it's not a consistent amount every year. It's maybe year 5, there's some sort of a payment. Year 8, you have to replace the boiler chiller, year 20 it's the roof, that sort of a thing. So that could be a payment that's a lumpy payment along with the availability payment. There are other jurisdictions though that actually just have a flat availability payment, and it's inclusive of the rehabilitation amount, but both payment structures are possible. And then finally, DBFOM, not much more to say here, except the O is included here, as you'll see. So even just looking at the diagram, you'll see there's an operations subcontractor. And so this is transferring even more responsibility and risk over to the private sector partner. And that might be typical for, some common examples are community centers or even transportation projects. Some of them will be a DBFOM, where the actual operator of the transit system will be the private sector partner. In a community center or an arena, the example of operations might be all the programming that happens kind of within the community center. That operations component gets included as part of DBFOM projects. Also very highly levered as well. So again, I use the 90-10 split as an example, but it could be a slight variation of that, but the idea to be levering up as much as possible. Claudia, anything to add here?
So I can just say that the City of Edmonton has used the DBFOM model at least twice. The first is for the Valley Line Southeast LRT project. And secondly, we have a downtown district energy project where we've used this model. And I'll talk about those again a little bit detailed later.
Great, thanks, Claudia. So those are of the classic P3 models. And then we're moving on to the progressive P3 model section, which is really something that we've seen in Canada, I'm going to say since 2022, I had to write it down. And they really were delivery models that kind of emerged from the Ontario market. It was in response to a lot of kind of post-COVID changes in the market, as well as some other factors for progressive P3s. But since then, there have been some progressive P3s or elements of progressive P3s in other jurisdictions across Canada. I think the other thing maybe I'll say about progressive P3s is while that term is fairly new in Canada, there are elements of progressive P3s that have existed kind of elsewhere in the world. Because as I talk about it, you hear me talk about things like collaboration and kind of early contractor involvement. And these are elements that do appear in other delivery models in other jurisdictions, but it was something that was less common in Canada. It was mostly the classic P3s. And then these progressive P3s in Canada kind of brought elements of other collaborative projects elsewhere in the world into a Canadian context, and then they became progressive P3s. So again, progressive P3s, recent evolution. Like I said, in 2022 is really when we started to see it. Early adopters being Ontario, but again, they are appearing in other jurisdictions across Canada as well. I'll talk about suitability of progressive P3s in a minute, but they really are most suited for complex projects. And really one of the key elements is that private sector partner, you're bringing them in earlier into the project so that you can work on the project solution together. So with the classic P3s that I had just talked about earlier, those I often consider like rigid P3 procurement processes as well, where there's a set of RFP documents that go out and the shortlisted bidders bid to that. It's on a fixed fee basis. They might advance designs to call it 30%, and then they sort of make some educated guesses about some of the things that they don't know, and then they bid a fixed price. Progressive P3s actually aim to bring the contractor in earlier so that where there might not be full specifications yet available for the project, they can develop the solution together and then hopefully advance the design more. Usually it's 60, 70, 80% design before they come up with a price. And then that price can be a fixed price, or there are some target price examples as well, but I will get into that in a minute. So some of the key differences with the traditional P3 models, again, early contractor engagement is really the idea of the collaborative development of some sort of a solution because you don't know enough at the beginning of the project. But it is a greater investment of time and resources for both the public and private partners. Oftentimes, we do talk about this with progressive P3s. There are definitely some advantages to it, but once you do select your private sector partner, you end up losing the competitive tension that you would otherwise have when you have multiple bidders on the project. So it is a lot more resource intensive for the public sector, kind of as you're going through the development phase. One other thing I'll say about progressive P3s is it's really, compared to traditional P3s, is actually introducing a new phase into the project. So you might have a RFQ and RFP, and then you're going to have like a development phase. Sometimes it's called a co-development phase, but it's that phase that you're co-developing the solution before you kind of get into construction. Whereas normally with a traditional P3, you'd go from RFQ, RFP to construction. And it's that development phase that does take a lot of time. It's resource intensive, and it also usually involves some payment to the private partner that you've selected as well, because they're investing a lot of time and energy to advance the design as well, with potentially an outcome, but not necessarily an outcome at the end of the development phase for them. So just some more advantages related to the progressive P3s. Some view it as a streamlined process. It is, in that you're selecting your private partner to go into that development phase, mostly based off of qualifications, qualitative factors. Often there's a kind of high-level submission that might be required, which I may consider, compared to a conventional P3, sort of a RFP light submission. So it is a more simplified procurement process. It is a lot faster to kind of get through an RFQ and RFP phase. So in that way, it does reduce some of the administrative burden for the public agencies or the owners. And so where agencies have kind of limited expertise or resources to kind of run a more detailed and complex conventional P3 tender, this could be advantageous for them. And that's just for the procurement phase. Those, as I mentioned, once you get into the development phase, it does become quite onerous for the public sector partner. Another advantage, we talked a lot about early contractor involvement, but it really is the idea of kind of bringing in the contractor early as a partner that you're going to work with to come up with your solution together. So, this might involve things like, what you thought was going to be the project isn't exactly the project at the end of the day. So you can explore project viability and maybe alternatives where, what you had in mind as a public sector owner for the project, perhaps elements of it are really costly. So let's say it's a transit line and maybe there's components of that are very costly. Well, maybe you can explore a slightly alternative alignment for that transit line with the contractor to see, if that kind of help makes the project a little bit more viable. I also mentioned that there's this development phase that you kind of work through to get design to a 60, 70, 80% design. What that also does is it actually reduces risk contingencies for the contractor. So there's maybe less of that educated guessing I was describing earlier in a conventional P3, where they can conduct more due diligence over this development phase and then feel more comfortable about the risks that they need to undertake, and then hopefully reduce the risk contingencies that they would need to add to their price. And then it also allows for greater time to kind of mitigate risks as well, mitigate or eliminate risks. Couple other advantages of progressive P3, collaborative price development. So as you're in this development phase, sort of developing the solution for the project together, it also allows you to jointly develop a fixed price during the project. This slide notes fixed price. It's not always fixed price. It does sometimes come in a target price format. And but still, you're advancing design, you're agreeing to a fixed price or a target price at the end, and that's presumably a number that jointly both the private and public partners feel more comfortable about. It also, as you're developing the price in a progressive P3, transparency is key, and so there is a lot of sharing of information about how those prices are developed and challenging of those prices to kind of come up with a price that both parties are comfortable with. And as a result, it does reduce claims and disputes during construction. Flexibility in project delivery. Again, because you have this development phase, it does allow the project itself to evolve depending on kind of what your needs are as a public sector owner. And so, where you have a really complex project and you don't know exactly all the things that you want of it at the beginning of the project, which is what you would need for a conventional P3. This allows you to, again, develop that solution together and maybe refine some of your requirements through the development phase. The last point here wanted to note is also just the idea of having off-ramps for a progressive P3. And so, oftentimes we hear concerns from municipalities and other public sector owners that, they don't want to get kind of stuck in this development phase and then really without the competitive tension have no kind of way out really. What the progressive P3 process allows is off-ramps. So, when you have this development phase, there might be certain points in time through that development phase. And that development phase could go 6, 9, 12 or more months, depending on the project. And you can have off-ramps through the process where you do have to compensate the private sector partner for the work that they've done. You get the IP rights to that work that they've done. But then you get to off-ramp if it's just not working out or it turns out that this isn't the right private partner for you.
And Ed, sorry to interrupt, but when you say off-ramp, I take it as basically a way out of the contract?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. It's
That
exiting basically the relationship.
either termination or something to get out of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a question about any experience or instance where an off-ramp was exercised. And yes, I think it's not frequent, but it has happened. And, that's always for the good of the project. And it may be for a variety of reasons. You just can't come to a price that kind of fits within an affordability budget that you have. That's usually the most common reason. But I suppose it could be also reasons like the relationship isn't working out, or you don't feel that as an owner, you don't feel that the private partner is kind of acting in good faith or in a way that you'd like over the long term. So just a summary of the progressive P3, some of the benefits we really talked about all these, but that idea of an integrated approach working together to achieve the project outcome and the solution that you want. Risk management really is key. I mean, again, this development phase really affords both parties an opportunity to advance the project and fully understand the risks so that you can, mitigate against the risk or eliminate it, and certainly get some more certainty around it to help with your pricing. Flexibility, we talked about the evolving nature during the development phase, and then aligned objectives as well. So when are these projects suitable? They're really suitable for very, very complex projects. Definitely wouldn't recommend them for, sort of more your standard infrastructure projects that are kind of a decent size and, where it might be a piece of vertical infrastructure. It really is a project that is complex or where you don't actually know all the requirements quite yet. So you quite often see progressive P3s on very, very large hospital projects, multi-billion-dollar hospital projects. You'll see it on very large transit systems. And you'll also see progressive P3s on some waste projects as well, where they're extremely complex and you're still kind of working out kind of the requirements at the time of going to procurement.
Ed, there are some questions that maybe we can address now while we're talking about progressive P3s.
Yeah, okay.
One is, has it ever happened that the owner and delivery partner did not agree on the price at the end of the co-development phase? how is this resolved and how do we avoid this? I guess that's just about the off-ramps we just talked about.
Yeah, I think so. And so, yes, that does happen, unfortunately. And how to avoid it, I think it really comes down to the working relationship between the public and private partners, kind of through that development phase. I think it's really important to be kind of upfront about, say, budget constraints that you might have. Or parameters you have to work within. It doesn't mean give them a number and they have to kind of fit it within that project, but it's, maybe it's providing a range or just being upfront kind of where your limitations are. And then it's also being transparent through the entire development phase. So it really should never be something where you're just advancing the design through, call it a 12-month development phase, and then you're talking about price in the 12th month. You should be talking about price and refining that price through the development phase so that there's no surprises and you're not sort of in a situation where you've done all this work, but you just can't agree on the price.
We also have a comment or question just about if you could expand on a high level regarding the timelines for the procurement process specific to progressive P3s.
Yeah, I think, well, with that, maybe what I'll say about it, instead of kind of quoting timelines, maybe what I'll say is that for a progressive P3, overall, it might take more time. I think it depends on compared to a conventional P3. That could also be proven untrue as well. But I guess it really depends on the resources that the public sector owner has to get through this development phase. So usually you'll have an RFQ or RFQ and RFP for a progressive P3 in order to find your development partner. Sometimes that actually RFQ and RFP is actually combined into a single RFP, but just kind of with stages. But nonetheless, that usually ends up being quite short, much shorter than what your conventional P3 would be. But it's that development phase that could be much longer. So really depending on the project, I've seen this development phase as short as 9 months. And then I've actually seen it longer than a couple of years. And so it really is depending on kind of how complex the project is, what resources you have as the public sector owner to kind of work through that development phase.
Great. Another question about progressive P3 and whether owners would sometimes use an independent pricing analysis and have that done.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear all the question. Is that just related to progressive P3s?
Progressive P3s, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So usually what we would recommend in the development phase of a progressive P3 is, first of all, making sure you're staffed up either internally or with advisors to kind of help you through that development phase. And a lot of that has to do with obviously development of the design, but then also price, so that, as you're going through this development phase and as that price keeps getting refined, you have the capabilities to be able to challenge that price to try to build it up yourself from the ground up to compare against what the private partner is putting forward to you. Again, that might be an internal capability that you have, but more often than not, it's going to be an external capability. The part of the question, though, that asks about an independent kind of, I guess, cost advice, if you mean by independent, sort of someone that kind of third party is going to say, yes, this is a fair price versus no, this is not a fair price. You could have that in there, but I actually haven't seen in this instance where that third parties views and conclusions about price are binding. It's more about having a third party that you probably engage to kind of help you in, I guess, assessing the price that's put forward by the private partner.
Just on that note, there's also a question about whether it's possible to have at least 2 delivery partners through to the co-development phase to maintain competitive tension, if there's advantages or disadvantages in doing that.
Great question. And yes, that does happen. We don't see it very much in Canada, but actually there is an example in the US, in Los Angeles. It's a project by LA Metro. It's called the Sepulveda Transit Corridor Project. And that is one where they've actually selected 2 partners. So they went from like a big, call it long list, and they narrowed it down to 2. And then it's those 2 partners that in parallel are moving through this development phase that I was describing. That one has some unique elements as well, because that project and the 2 partners are actually proposing different solutions for the transit corridor. But nonetheless, it is kind of what you're asking in the question. It's advancing the 2 in parallel in order to maintain the competitive tension. So that's a big advantage. A big disadvantage of that is that it's double the work for you as the authority. So all the work I talked about that you need to do as a public sector owner for a progressive P3 in that development phase, it's basically ×2 because you're dealing with two sets of partners. But certainly, hopefully, the outcome at the end is a price competitive final single solution.
Okay, and there's 2 other questions before I think we move on.
Sure.
One is just a question about how a progressive P3 differs from a progressive design build.
Yeah. So when we say progressive P3, and actually we're going to talk about progressive design build, but lots of similarities. The biggest difference is when we say progressive P3, it includes a private financing element. So it's a progressive P3 is going to be a progressive DBF, progressive DBFM, or progressive DBFOM largely.
And finally, how are progressive contracts and collaborative contracts the same or different?
I would say very similar. So as I was mentioning at the kind of outset when talking about progressive P3s, is that when it was established, mostly firstly in the Ontario market, but now kind of across jurisdictions in Canada, it was really trying to bring different collaborative elements from other approaches in other jurisdictions. So I guess what I would say is when you hear collaborative delivery model, often it refers to progressive P3s, but it could also refer to a progressive design build. It could also apply to an IPD or an alliance. But when you hear about collaborative delivery models, it's usually just referring to a sort of a collaborative element of the delivery model. And usually that means some sort of development phase. Does that cover the questions, Claudia?
Yeah, that's all the questions for now, I think, on progressive P3s. So
Okay, great.
move
I'll
on.
just move on. We can come back actually to this is usually the topic of most interest because it is an emerging delivery model. There's examples of successful ones in Canada, but it really has only been around since 2022. So there haven't been a lot of examples of successfully closed projects, but only because many projects are still in their development phase. So some of the traditional procurements that here will probably kind of move through a lot more quickly. These are probably delivery models that you're all mostly familiar with, but design, build, design, bid, build, construction management, and engineering, procurement, and construction. So these traditional delivery models are really delivery models where the public sector owner is retaining a lot of the risk, though there are some differences between them, which in terms of risk allocation that varies. So just starting with the design bid build, probably the most conventional of conventional delivery models, but this is the separate design and construction of the project. The public sector, of course, usually will hire designers, create very, very detailed project designs and contract documents, and those will go out to tender for the construction. So in terms of the structure, again, separate design and construction contracts. That also means more risk retention by the public sector owner. And then once the asset is complete, the owner will operate and maintain the asset as they normally would. I guess in terms of the advantages, it's very clear design and detailed specifications, which is great for bidders because it provides a lot of certainty But it also, because of that competitive process, usually here it says cost-effective bidding. Often it's also low-cost bidding, but then that can have a whole bunch of other issues as well in terms of during the construction phase. To the extent that there's any variations, then that's going to be kind of add-on costs for the public sector owner. Actually, Claudia, did you want to say anything about DBBs?
Yeah, just to illustrate your point, like the design bid build model is the most common model used for delivering infrastructure in the city of Edmonton, especially when the requirements are pretty well known for the city. So yeah, we use it a lot.
And I'd say that's consistent with other municipalities that we work with across the country. More often than not, it's going to be design bid build, particularly for smaller projects too. And then it's the other delivery models that are used for more complex projects. Design build model, just kind of one step over from the design bid build model in terms of risk transfer, but it's really the bundling of the design and construction components. So it does transfer a little bit more risk to the private sector. The private sector. And then again, similar to DBB, when the asset's complete, it gets handed over back to the public sector. Some of the advantages, just because you're bundling the two, it does allow for some additional innovation by the private sector. And it also, again, it transfers a little bit more risk over to the private sector.
Yeah, and City of Edmonton has used design build as well, and I'll talk about two of those projects, the first and most recent project that we've used the model for.
Thanks, Claudia. And then just to round out some of those traditional delivery models, construction management. So here the owner retains a lot of risk, and they basically hire the general contractor to coordinate a lot of the construction activities. And some of those activities are listed here, but all the scheduling, the budgeting, constructability, that's usually the job of the construction manager. But it still allows for good control by the owner. And then finally, there's engineering, procurement, and construction projects, so EPC projects. Maybe view these as turnkey models for really large and complex projects. It does make it a lot easier and simplified for the public sector owner, because you're basically handing over project management. There's cost predictability because it's usually a fixed price. There's a reduction of risk because you're kind of integrating all the functions together. But again, it's sort of a single kind of turnkey approach for large complex projects. And then other delivery models we'll touch on briefly as well. And so that is the PDB, which we had a question about earlier, the IPD, Integrated Project Delivery and Alliance. So I guess if we were to group all of these together, which is a little bit unfair because they are different projects, but they have a lot of common characteristics as well. So, some of the key considerations are that there's no private capital investment. So that's going back to the question earlier about progressive P3s and PDBs. But for all of these delivery models, the idea is that after construction is complete, that asset gets handed back over to the public sector to maintain and operate, as they would. So no private financing. They all also involve some early collaboration. So again, some sort of earlier selection of the private sector partner to basically come into the tent to develop and design the project and to agree on a price. Flexible delivery, so that really is the idea around still during some sort of a phase, whether it's called the development phase or co-development phase or what have you, the ability to be able to kind of amend, revise, adjust the project so that you're being flexible in terms of kind of what the outcome is ultimately going to be, but to adapt to, changing requirements. And these are similar to the progressive P3s, suitable for very complex projects and first of a kind type projects. There's a point here about success rate. It's being too soon to evaluate because they are fairly new. That is true, but there are actually a growing number of successful examples of some of these delivery models. So, for example, progressive DBs. Actually, Claudia, invite you to talk about City of Edmonton. I also know even further west in BC, there's some good examples of successful progressive DBs. But what about in Edmonton?
Yeah, we haven't used progressive DBs, but we have used the integrated project delivery model. We're currently in use, so they haven't been completed yet, but they're in progress.
Great. And then kind of at the provincial level in Ontario, for example, Infrastructure Ontario is looking at progressive DBs. There's a couple of them in play, I think. And then also just when it comes to social infrastructure projects, they're kind of revisiting how progressive DBs and alliance models will be delivered. A little more on the progressive DBs. I think we covered most of these points, but I will note that it's usually using a target price instead of a fixed price. So usually after this development phase, you jointly will come up with a target price. And what that means is exactly how it sounds, a target price that you feel pretty comfortable about, both parties. However, to the extent that the final price varies, there's usually some sort of a pain share and gain share between the two parties, where the ultimate price is lower or higher than the target price that you establish. And usually there's bands around that. So the further away in either direction that you are from the target price, then there's kind of greater amounts of pain share and gain share. I think some of these other points we've actually covered, so I probably won't get into them, but all the themes that you've already heard about early contractor involvement and collaborative development. And then finally, IPDs and alliance models, both fairly new. There are some successful examples within or across the country. I think one thing maybe to note for both IPDs and alliance is that they kind of use a single agreement, kind of where all parties kind of are a part of that single agreement, where they share the risks and the rewards. IPDs, what I often get a question around how are IPDs different from alliances, and IPDs actually, and would be interested in hearing about Edmonton, Claudia, but allow for some legal regress where there's poor performance. But in the case of alliance projects, it's usually a no blame culture. So you're all working towards a solution together, and there's usually waivers against kind of finger pointing and blaming to preclude legal action between parties. Anything to add on the IPDs, Claudia?
Not really. I see these two models as very similar, the IPD and the alliance models from my understanding. So I can't really kind of, provide a lot of distinction between them. I guess we've primarily sort of focused on the IPD model. But yeah, I acknowledge it's very similar.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say there's a point here about open book financial model, but that is a big element of IPDs and alliances. It's full transparency of project costs because the idea being that the public and private parties are working very closely together to develop the solution, and potentially there's some pain share and gain share involved. So it's being very transparent upfront about all the costs.
There's a few questions that might be worth addressing at this point, Ed. One is just about what the key characteristics would be considered at an RFQ stage. Are there special considerations when selecting your co-development partner? I think that probably is with respect to all of these kind of progressive models, right?
Yeah, I think the same principles would apply. But I mean, there's lots of precedents to draw from. So if your municipality is looking at kind of one of these delivery models, whether it's PDB, IPD, Alliance, or the progressive P3s, in terms of what you might ask for in the RFQ, there will be lots of examples, but it is largely qualifications and experience. because at the RFQ stage, you're really opening it up to all the different kind of private partner parties that might be interested. And so it's really about kind of relevant experience, relevant being kind of similar size and scale of the project, whether they're relevant kind of asset class, jurisdiction, some of those projects, and some of the experiences that the companies themselves have. One thing sometimes you'll hear about these projects is within either the RFQ phase, or it could be in the RFP phase as well, is collaborative behavioral assessments, CBAs. And those collaborative behavioral assessments really involve, because you're talking about working with a partner through a development phase, and that development phase again could be 6, 9, 12, or many, many more months beyond that. You want to make sure that you're selecting a partner that you will be able to work with and can handle high pressure situations that undoubtedly encounter. So sometimes you'll hear about CBAs. Not all jurisdictions like it because it is quite subjective, but is allocating some points to these CBAs where you actually interview the different consortia that are coming together, and it will be separately, and you'll put them in situations. And so, you might, give them, there's a lot of ways to do it, but, you might give them some sort of a case study that they read kind of on the day of, and then they have to solve the problem. It's almost like an MBA group project, but they have to solve that problem, and they have to do it in front of you. So you see how they collaborate, and then you might throw in some wrenches kind of while they're kind of working out a solution. And then another part of the day might be interviews with some of the KPIs, not KPIs, the key personnel that they have to put forward. And so all that would get evaluated and become a part of a CBA score that would ultimately become a part of the RFQ or RFP score.
And I think the final one before we move on, Ed, is I think the slides do distinguish a bit between the PDB, Professional Design Build, and the Integrated Project Delivery, but there's an ask to sort of elaborate on the difference between them.
Okay, so I think I would actually say that there's a lot of similarities between PDB and IPD. But I think with PDB, actually, if I just kind of go back, it does get to usually a target price, whereas I think in IPD, sometimes it will actually use the fixed price as well, just actually confirming. I'll put an asterisk on that. But a PDB does use a target price, again, with that pain share, gain share mechanism that I mentioned. Yeah. So I was going to say one other part about the IPDs, which is I had mentioned that legal redress, and so IPDs often allows for, I guess, legal redress for poor performance. Any other questions before we move on?
There's another question, and it's really about the CBAs that you mentioned, just about, the projects go on for years, and how do you deal with CBAs for the people that come and go during that project? And you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a common question. So, there's usually key individuals that you'll at the outset include as part of the CBA, and you'll evaluate them accordingly. And then if the development phase is going to be a long development phase, there's usually some sort of mechanism, I guess, within the contract for the replacement of these key individuals. So to the extent that there's a key individual that was a part of the process, and then life happens and they kind of move on. If the private partners looking to replace that key individual, usually they have to meet all of the qualifications that the original key individual had to meet. And then sometimes you'll see instances where the public sector owner wants to actually go through a CBA process, like not only look at the qualifications, so yes, submit a CV and show that that new key individual has the same qualifications, but then also put them through that same exercise to see, maybe it's a modified format, but to make sure that they kind of pass that test before allowing for that replacement.
Okay, and one final question. Well, it's probably not the final question, but before we move on, there's an ask to provide an example of what are the risks rewards shared using the IPD or alliance versus other delivery models, just to understand, how they're more collaborative.
Okay, I'm just, let me think on kind of how maybe to answer that question. I think maybe probably the biggest example of the risk reward is the pain share gain share that I had mentioned in the pricing. So that will appear in the progressive DB, for example. It also can appear in IPD or alliance, but you're coming up with a target price. And then it's a risk reward because to the extent that if ultimately that outturn cost is higher than whatever target price that you established, there is a sharing in, I guess, whatever that ultimate cost is. And so in that way, you're sharing in the risk and reward for the final price.
Yeah, that just sort of goes to another comment that was included. And the question is gain and pain share in the progressive DBs trying to balance out the risk between private and public partners?
Yeah, I'd say that's a fair
Yeah.
comment. I think the other probably element of the pain share gain share is it's really creating a shared incentive because you are potentially going to share in the pain, for example, of the final cost being higher than what you established as your target price. Is that shared incentive of trying to keep it under the at or under the target price as much as possible. Okay, and unless I think we have some time for more questions later, but I think the one thing, there is this alternative service delivery and concession models. I probably won't spend too much time on this. It really just has to do with the outsourcing of operations and maintenance for projects. So if you think about the DBFMs or the DBFOMs that I was describing earlier, it's really that M or that OM component that you could potentially outsource. And that's what the ASD and concession models are referring to. So it's after an asset is complete, after it's been designed, it's been constructed, and potentially just outsourcing some of that work for private sector delivery. Actually, one other thing maybe I'll just mention related to the performance-based contracts is that they do have performance criteria. So similar to when I was talking about the P3s and the availability payments and the ability for deductions for underperformance, you would see that in ASD and concession contracts as well. There's also potential for bonus structures. So, usually those performance criteria, if the private sector can outperform on those, then they can get bonus payments as a result as well, just in order to incentivize them to do better than what they're contractually obligated to do. There's a summary slide here that I guess everyone will have access to when they receive these slides, but it's attempting to really show the differences between the different delivery models at the highest of levels. I think these two columns labeled private capital investment and whole life cycle consideration are sort of the most telling between the different delivery models, but there's different considerations as well related to risk allocation and kind of how the procurement process looks. So I won't go into each row since we've talked about all the delivery models, but a useful reference piece. The other thing I would say is like there's best use cases here, but really it often just depends on the individual project and also the resources and capability that the public sector owner has. And that can, while on paper it might look like your project fits a particular delivery model, it may be for other reasons that you choose another delivery model, and that's not the wrong answer either. Okay, Claudia, let's talk about some Edmonton specific projects.
Over to me. Yes, thanks. So for my contribution to this session, I'll outline some City of Edmonton policy that's been implemented to guide our delivery model decisions, as well as highlight a few of the projects that provide an example of what Ed just talked about, the different models. So first of all, I wanted to give you a bit of a background about the policies that have been implemented in Edmonton regarding P3s and delivery models for capital projects. Since May of 2010, we had a P3 policy. So this policy was implemented to guide the city's approach to evaluating and pursuing potential P3s and to provide for process certainty and clarity for stakeholders throughout a P3's life cycle by ensuring a consistent framework for selection, evaluation, approval, delivery, and monitoring of P3s. This policy required that any project with a capital investment of 30 million or more be considered for P3 by way of a screening. So it was like pretty low threshold for P3, but we sort of use that policy to sort of evaluate projects on a go forward basis. So the P3 policy, however, has been replaced with a more flexible policy called the Capital Infrastructure Project Delivery Policy. And on the next slide, the new policy confirms Edmonton's commitment to enhancing project delivery excellence in public infrastructure and service delivery while ensuring the public interest is protected and council priorities are met. So although the policy recognizes these noted four delivery models, and that is the design bid build, construction management, and public-private partnership that we sort of outlined earlier, it's open for consideration of other delivery models as well. Already talked about the IPD model that we're using. On the next slide, we've sort of described the policy outlines four factors that need to be considered in selecting a delivery model. And some, I think Ed probably talked a little bit about, the different models and where it, how it works best. But in our policy, we talk about first, the opportunity for improved services and better value for money through appropriate allocation of resources, risks, benefits, and responsibility between the city and private sector there. Secondly is the ability to leverage private sector expertise and innovation opportunities through competitive and transparent processes. Thirdly is the need for improved certainty around project costs, schedule, quality, and service delivery. And finally, there's an assessment of the optimization of the use of the asset and included services over the term. And on the next slide, it outlines sort of four principles to guide the application of the delivery models. First, the type of project delivery model will be considered only when public interest is safeguarded through stakeholder engagement, enforceable outcomes, transparency, and mechanisms for adapting to future needs. Secondly, the type of delivery model is pursued if it delivers better value for money than other methods the city uses, balancing risks, rewards, expertise, competition, and long-term efficiencies. The private sector confidence will be ensured through transparent, competitive procurement processes, protecting confidentiality and efficient procurement and proposal assessments. And a project governance framework ensures transparency, due diligence, effective project management, stakeholder communication, policy conformity, financial accountability, and oversight. And for the most part, the determination of the appropriate delivery model under this new policy will be undertaken sort of at the administration level, but the administration will be required to report to council on projects that are $250 million or more with the rationale for why a certain delivery model was chosen over others. So now, you probably can't, I'm not sure if you'll be able to access a link through the slides, but we do have a map, a capital projects map that sort of scopes out the various different infrastructure projects that are undertaken by the City of Edmonton, and provides an assessment of where they're at. So if you're wondering what's happening in the city, that's a good map to check out. Okay, so now let's move on to some of the projects. So this one is the Valley Line West LRT project. So this project is the second stage of the Valley Line LRT that is currently operating between Millwoods and downtown. That is, like, the first stage is operating between Millwoods and downtown. And this project is to deliver the second leg of the LRT infrastructure that goes from downtown to Lewis Farms in the west end of Edmonton. It includes 14 street level stops and 2 elevated stations. There are 2 new bridges and 2 new facilities. One facility is a full operations and maintenance facility, and the other is a storage facility. There's also an elevated guideway along 87th Avenue. So the total cost is $2.6 billion. The project closed in December of 2020, so just in the height of the pandemic. And it closed with Marigold Infrastructure Partners after a 12-month procurement that included an RFQ and an RFP stage. The next project is the one of the city's DBFOM projects. It also included the provision of vehicles, and this is the Valley Line Southeast LRT project, to which the Valley Line West will connect. This is the leg of the Valley Line LRT that runs from Millwoods to downtown, and it includes the beautiful elevated Davie Station and park and ride facility. It included the construction of the Tawatna Bridge over the North Saskatchewan and a tunnel that brings the LRT to the quarters in downtown. This contract was executed in 2016 and was worth $1.8 billion. It includes an operating maintenance term until December of 2050. The line reached service commencement in October of 2023. The other P3 DBFOM project on the next slide is the Downtown District Energy project that the city is delivering through the DBFOM model. So the city entered into agreement with EPCOR District Energy to deliver phase 1 of the Downtown District Energy Initiative. The first phase will see 3 buildings being connected to the district energy system. It's starting out as a natural gas boiler system, but it's planned to incorporate other low carbon energy sources for the full district energy system build out. And this was a negotiating agreement with our subsidiary, EPCOR, and it closed in December 2023. So although the city, we've had experience with P3 models, there's still lots of room for more traditional procurement models. So the next slide, this summarizes the city's first and also the most recent design build project. The city's first design build project was the Smith Crossing project, which was awarded almost 20 years ago. The project involved the twinning of parts of 23rd Avenue and 119th Street and the construction of a multi-use trail. In sort of pursuing a design build in this project, we were looking for private sector innovation, particularly with respect to environmental sensitive and geotechnically challenging areas for that project. And one of the most recent projects that the city has is in the process of delivering through design build is the south extension of the Capital Line LRT. It's a 4.5 kilometer extension, which includes an underpass as well as a bridge crossing Blackmud Creek and Anthony Henday Drive. The project also includes a new operations and maintenance facility and a multimodal LRT station and a smaller neighborhood LRT station. Now, the city undertook a delivery model assessment, which prioritized integration risk and cost certainty. And based on this assessment, the DB model provided the best value for money. So that's why the Capital Line South extension is being delivered by DB. Now, to back up even further, more traditional models. As I mentioned, the design bid build model is the most common delivery model for the City of Edmonton projects. We have had standard form agreements for over 20 years, which have been modified based on changes in the construction industry and city requirements. And as I mentioned, it works well when the city needs to have control over the design and the quality of the infrastructure. And we're very familiar with the type of infrastructure and the risks associated with it to sort of take that on and proceed in that way. The other more traditional model that we've used a lot, I think because it involves early contractor engagement, is the construction management delivery model. Typically, we go with construction management at risk, which we call CMAR. And we developed our own form of agreement, which was first used for an earlier South LRT extension. And we've also used that model for facilities as well, like in terms of the standard sort of documents around that, including Rogers Place was a form of construction management. So one of the primary benefits that we've found using construction management is the ability to stage a project, but the disadvantage is cost certainty. Although, when we're able to sort of get a guaranteed maximum price locked in, we, are able to address that cost certainty concern. And we found it's well suited for renovations when you're not sure what you're getting into, and you can sort of start out smaller with that.
Claudia, there's a question around why is cost certainty a disadvantage? But I think here it's just meaning
Oh,
actually it's uncertain. Is that right?
yeah. So it's unless you have a guaranteed maximum price in your construction management agreement, or you're able to lock that in, you don't have cost certainty. So it is sort of open, and you're not really sure until it's done what the total cost would be. And yeah, the last type of delivery model that I wanted to share is the integrated project delivery. And so there was a desire to have more of a collaborative approach. And so the City of Edmonton undertook development of a form of agreement that would best represent sort of what our concerns and issues would be, and would provide that sort of collaborative approach. So there's currently 3 projects that are being delivered through the IPD approach. First is the Edmonton Expo Center rehab. The Edmonton Expo Center hosts trade shows, concerts, conventions, and other sorts of events. The original halls, A through D, were constructed in 1983 and haven't been updated since they were opened. So the Edmonton Expo Center Rehabilitation Project is updating that the halls A through D and installing what I understand to be Canada's largest rooftop solar photovoltaic array. So that's one of the projects. The second one is the Blatchford Fire Station project, and it includes the detailed design and construction of a new emissions neutral LEED Silver certified fire station. And the third project is the Ambleside Integrated Site Phase 1. This project will build a City of Edmonton operations service site in southwest Edmonton to support the city's parks and road services and fleet and facility services branches. It will house operations, maintenance, administration, and staff support facilities, as well as an operations yard with bulk storage, fleet vehicle parking, and sand and salt storage facility. So hopefully those examples are helpful. And now I think it's time to turn back to any questions that might still be hanging out there that we haven't answered.
Feel free to put them in the chat. Actually, I don't know if participants are able to speak, but you could try or put it in the chat. There is actually one comment I want to address in the chat while we just wait to see if there's other questions. Is just related to DBBs. And, I made a point about the owner retaining a lot of the risk, and the comment about that being a oversimplification. I think that's a fair point. Yeah. I think it's just that when it comes to DBBs, just in talking and kind of working with a lot of jurisdictions, sometimes the owners don't try to embed some of the risk transfer in the contracts, and then that's why they end up holding some of the risk. Or also other instances where they do embed kind of risk transfer in the contracts, but they don't kind of hold the party, the private partner, or the designer, or I guess the contractor, to that embedded risk transfer. In those instances, often the risk goes back to the private sector owner. So it's a fair point. I think it's just that oftentimes the owner doesn't embed that risk transfer, or they don't enforce it.
Yeah, so what I found, Ed, is that typically when you're looking at a project, you kind of note sort of the biggest risks, and then you fine tune those so that you better understand the cost of those, or what sort of contingency both party you're putting on it, and then determine who's best to sort of take that risk, or sort of pay for it. But yeah, there's sometimes some of those risks that you might not account for, and then you're sort of looking to the contract to see, who's going to take it. But it's a good point that kind of no matter what delivery model, you want to make sure that you're properly accounting for the potential risk and the cost for those.
Any other questions from the group?
There are also 4 questions under the Q&A area.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't know there was a Q&A.
No worries.
Okay. There's one that asks about how you ensure accuracy of target price and that it is not inflated, balancing with the gain share. Is the gain share calibrated with the profit and overhead in the open book pricing?
Okay, so maybe I'll start off with that one. So yeah, in accuracy of a target price, and just kind of ensuring it's kind of the right number, I think goes back to the point about making sure that kind of both parties, but for this audience, particularly the private sector owner, that they are well resourced internally, and also potentially with external support, but well resourced to be able to assess the target price. So, as I mentioned during the development phase, really the first thing you want to do is, as you're advancing the design, you don't want to kind of wait to the end to kind of talk about target price. You should continuously refine that target price along the way. And then you just want to make sure that you kind of have the right resources and capabilities to be able to challenge and build up the price on your end as well, if I'm just talking from a public sector owner's perspective, so that when your private partner is developing and refining that price, you're able to basically have a view of your own in terms of what the price should be. What I've seen in some other projects, some jurisdictions start to do is, depending where you are at in the RFQ and RFP of a progressive P3, sometimes at that RFP phase, you may even ask them to submit a price. It's not a binding price, but you may ask them to submit a price. And then that also gives you a basis to be able to build from as you're kind of going through the development phase. So there are a few things that you can do to try to help ensure that it's kind of the right target price, and not just sort of kind of beefed up so that there's ultimately gain share, but it really is just becoming incumbent on the public sector owner and their the resources that they have to be able to go challenge that price. And you'll do that from building it from the ground up, like I mentioned, but also try to do benchmarking with other projects as well. There's a question about the first transit DBF not being successful, and then the later transit extension getting delivered by DB. That probably is in reference to Edmonton. Claudia, is there anything to say about that?
I think so, and I'm not sure I totally understand it. Maybe the slides weren't clear, but I was talking about 2 different transit projects. So one, the DBF is currently being delivered at the DBF, and that's the Valley Line West project, which is connecting to the currently operating DBFOM. And the second project is the Capital Line South extension, which is being pursued as a design build. And the rationale for that delivery model is that we did do an analysis, and that model was the sort of provided the best value.
And then
So
Claudia,
hopefully,
question about Blanchford Fire Station being
yeah,
selected.
and in terms of the reason why it was selected to proceed as an IPD, and I don't have the answer to that. All I would sort of point back to are some of the considerations and factors that were outlined in our policy that I would expect were considered.
There's a question here about the lowest dollar value for projects we're talking about today that I guess that might be in reference to like vis-a-vis the different delivery models. And maybe first off, I'll start by saying some jurisdictions will actually have a number associated with it. So, you know, often you'll see a number that a project needs to have a capital cost of, call it 100 million for it to be a P3 project, for example. That is the number that tends to get kind of used just as the highest level of benchmark in terms of kind of project size. You know, maybe that number has kind of crept up now because of construction cost to something like 125 million or so. Before you consider it as a P3, I think that would extend to the progressive and the collaborative projects as well, just sort of as a minimum. But I do think it is project specific because, you know, just because you hit 100 million, for example, doesn't automatically mean it's a P3 either. You know, the traditional delivery models like a DB construction management, those could be for extremely large projects as well.
Yeah, agreed. And that was one of the, I guess, issues we had with Edmonton's previous P3 policy, because it did kind of require sort of a review of whether P3 would be appropriate for like a $30 million project, which is, you know, depending on the nature of the project, that's pretty low for, you know, sort of a P3. So that was one of the reasons why, you know, it's now more broad and is talking about different delivery models.
Great. I think that's all the questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. I think it was great, and I love the engagement. There's some pointed questions there, and I really appreciate sort of not only the information, but how you guys were able to sort of make it really tangible and practical for people that are learning. I'm not going to lie, I learned along the way as well too. So thank you so much to both of you. Thanks to everyone for attending today. I do want to remind everyone, for those that haven't done it already, you are able to download our digital tools. I do believe my colleague Samar put that in the chat function right off the top. But once again, a special thank you to our session sponsors, Amico, BLG, Epcor, Fasken, Graham, and Mainline, and as well to our speakers today, Ed and Claudia. Thank you so much. For those of you that are joining us for the full session, we look forward to seeing you again for episode 4, which will be the P3 procurement process, and that will be co-facilitated by Marianne Smith, a partner with Blake's Castles and Graydon LLP, and Lisa Roswell, a senior solicitor and team lead procurement with the legal services with the city of Winnipeg. You'll receive a calendar invite for this session, but if you do have any challenges in the lead up to it, please don't hesitate to reach out to my colleagues, Rachel or Samar, and they'll be happy to help you out. And until then, thanks again, everyone. See you soon. And for those of us enjoying another spot of winter, stay warm.